that really targets child welfare, but also the other systems that child welfare works alongside with, which is a multitude of folks. And I know a lot of you are out, attending this training and watching. So schools and mental health and substance use, folks that work in those fields, et cetera. But the model came to Ohio. So back in the day, 2010, 11 or so, basically the state of Ohio in child welfare said, you know what, we don't do a really good job at assessing domestic violence when it comes to child welfare cases and families that are experiencing domestic violence. So they did some research and looked at different domestic violence trainings, and this was the one, the Safe and Together model was the one that they landed on. And they brought it to Ohio, and they asked 4 counties in Ohio to go through the full training and start doing this model or using this model in the field with families. And so Fairfield County was one of the 4 pilot counties. And so I was actually one of the, I was a caseworker at the time, and I was able to go through this training as a caseworker, use this model out in the field when I was working with families. And then there was a third-party researcher from a separate university, not affiliated with Safe and Together, not affiliated with the state of Ohio, that gathered research and said, like, hey, how are we doing now that we're approaching domestic violence differently? And we were doing better. We were getting better assessments. We were better outcomes for families and children. So the state of Ohio, with Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, said, okay, so this is that good. We want all 88 counties to be trained in this model. We were the first, Ohio was the first of 50 states to say, let's have all counties trained in the same model. So that's how I started how I became a trainer, and started training across the state of Ohio. And then, like April was saying, when she did the introductions, approximately 2015, so about 5 years ago, this training has become so broad, not just in Ohio, but across the United States and internationally, that they needed more trainers. So since 2015, I have been an adjunct faculty member, so I am certified to train nationally and internationally this model. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I know April had mentioned that you guys can put questions in the comment box. And so I will do my best to answer questions as we go along. But there's a lot of content. This is a really, really big training. This is a really big idea to wrap your brain around, especially start thinking differently for folks that are hearing some of this information. So if anything, I asked April, worst case scenarios, if there are comments and questions, please, please, please put them in the comment box. And if I don't get to all of them, she'll send them to me and I will answer every single one of them, send them back to her, and then she can disperse them. So April, you can change the slide. All right, so quickly, these are the objectives. So first and foremost is to introduce you to what the Safe and Together model would call a perpetrator pattern framework. And essentially what this is meaning, and we'll talk about this a little bit as I go through the next 50 minutes or so, is when we're using the Safe and Together model, we are keeping the perpetrator at the forefront of our practice at all times. I'm gonna also rewind a little bit just in case as I go along. This is just a disclaimer. So when we're talking about the Safe and Together model as trainers, we always try to disclose that domestic violence happens in heterosexual relationships, same-sex relationships, doesn't matter race, gender, ethnicity, anything. But when we talk about this just for the purposes of training, typically we'll talk about this in a heterosexual relationship with the male being the perpetrator. Because what statistics show is that in said relationships where there's a male and female, the male is vastly the perpetrator of domestic violence. Now, this model acknowledges that it doesn't mean that in heterosexual relationships that women cannot be a perpetrator of domestic violence. And again, like I just said, that in same-sex relationships, that doesn't mean that there's not domestic violence, because we know that exists as well. So the objectives is to make sure that you guys at least have some type of understanding of what we mean by a perpetrator pattern and keeping the perpetrator at the forefront of our practice. We're also going to introduce you to what the Safe and Together model components are, the principles of the model, and how those guide our practice, and how this model is being used to enhance the good practice that is already happening. So one of the things that I know, and through my job and what I do here and what I've done here, you know, in different capacities, is that there's lots of good things that are happening in our community, and lots of folks in their own arena, so to speak, that are using best practice. And so this model has been as a best practice model, hence the reason the state of Ohio said, like, all child welfare needs to be using this model. And then I'll also share with you a little bit about what the 4-day core training is like for this model. And obviously this is the 1-day overview training. You can change the slide. All right, my little notes. All right, so the mission of the Safe and Together Institute, as it says, is to create, nurture, and sustain a global network of domestic violence informed child welfare professionals, communities, and systems. So again, this training, a lot of folks go through, it is definitely targeted for child welfare. However, it also is most certainly necessary for those agencies and community partners that child welfare works with. Anytime that I know I'm training, even if it's at a child welfare agency, sometimes I'll have community partners, people from schools or early Head Start or mental health counselors attending those trainings as well. So I always try to make it applicable. So again, I know a lot of you are from different fields in social services and schools and et cetera. So any questions that you have specific to what you do in the model, I'm more than happy to talk about and answer. Probably won't be able to do it in this hour, but if you have a comment specific to your field, I'd be more than happy to answer. You can switch the slide. All right, so where is Safe and Together? This slide needs to be updated because I was looking at the US. I have not had the opportunity to train internationally yet. I am able to, but my passport's not updated, so that's a problem. And then COVID, that's a whole nother issue. But so US, some of the other states that the Safe and Together model is in: Oregon, Connecticut, New Jersey, where else did I put? Wisconsin. Internationally, I think Ireland's not on there, Thailand. So there's lots of places, as you can see. What I think is most interesting about this model is that clearly all of these places, as you can see, there's different cultures, different races, ethnicities. And this model is applicable in all of those places. So even if we look at United States or even our great state of Ohio, there's lots of different areas of Ohio. There's urban areas and metropolitan areas, rural areas, Appalachia, Ohio, and we train all over, and this model still holds up as best practice throughout. You can change. All right, so a little bit about the model. Obviously, like it said, is we want better outcomes for families and for systems. So the families that child welfare are serving, as well as the systems that child welfare connects with and intersects with. So if we started at the bottom, see, I'm pointing at things now, and then normally I have like the slides in front of me. So if we start at the bottom of the arrow, this is all new, like virtual training for me. At the bottom of the arrow where it says foundation, so our model characteristics, the model principles, and the critical components. So things that, what it's leading to is, so practice tools. So some of the things that we talk about is mapping. Mapping is a tool that we use in the model. We do it as a group activity, a small group activity, then talk about it in a large group, of essentially how we're like staffing a case. Right? So cases that we come across that have a component of domestic violence, and how are we mapping these cases? And it's very different than how child welfare typically would staff a case. So for those of you who have been to our meetings or any staffings that have been associated with cases that shared cases, in child welfare, we tend to tell a whole big story about, like, well, we first got involved here, and then we did this, and oh yeah, I forgot about this part, and then this is what happened, and it becomes a big long story. But what this model allows us is to be very deliberate, and it's just more condensed and concise. So it's a mapping tool. It gives us ideas for next steps, etc. Pivoting is a tool that we use as a trainer, as well as during interviews, specifically with domestic violence perpetrators, and that ability to pivot. So oftentimes what we'll say is domestic violence perpetrators during interviews, they're really good at getting you kind of sidetracked and not talking about what do we need to talk about. And it's their behaviors and how their behaviors are impacting their significant other and their children. So what we want to do is we work on pivoting tools, and how do we pivot back from we're not needing to talk about this, we need to kind of pivot and talk about this. Practice tools, case planning guides. So for those families who are involved ongoing or for a longer term with child welfare, we have case planning guides, supervisor matrix. So we have tools for supervisors to use with their staff to help them, whether it's interviewing or case planning, documentation, etc. So for supervisors to use, and pathways and planning tools. One of the things that I would say in regards to practice tools, when I actually took this training back in, I think it was like 2010 or 2011, I was an intake caseworker and I sat through this training. And I remember walking out of this training thinking, wow, like not only was this great information, but there are those tools that I can physically use. Like I can take this piece of paper because I have this tool and I can take it out in the field at my home visit tomorrow and I can use this. So many times I go to trainings and, you know, it's really good information. Like, wow, I really learned a lot about brain development or how substance use and addiction impacts the brain. But sometimes it's like you really have to force yourself to use that when you're out in the field and remember those things. This model, and again, it's not because I'm being biased because I'm trained to teach this model, but because genuinely, you walk away with tools like that very second. Like I know how to use this model. I have something I can physically use. So if you go to the top where it says domestic violence informed child welfare systems. So what we want to be able to do is improve the systems and collaborate better with the systems that we are connected with, which I had mentioned earlier. And all of these things, so when we are using the model characteristics, the model components, the critical components of the model, as well as collaborating better with systems, as well as these practice tools, the mapping tools, the pivoting tools, your case planning tools, etc. What this is doing is it's leading to better outcomes for families. It's getting us better safety outcomes, better well-being outcomes, better partnerships, not only with the families that we're serving, but also those community partners that we're working with. We're creating better case plans. For folks, we are holding perpetrators accountable for their behaviors and how they're harming children and their family. And we're not holding the non-offending parent or the survivor and holding her accountable for things that are not her fault. I can change the slide. All right, I need to take a drink real quick. Okay. So some things that the Safe and Together Institute offers, and it's vastly enhanced since May of this year. I'm sorry, March. Gosh, it seems like even longer than that. So organizational assessments and consultation, core and advanced trainings. So the core training is 4 days. It is, I think we'll talk about it a little bit later, so I might be jumping ahead of myself, but it is a 4-day training. So this overview that we're doing in this hour is trying to provide you a high-level overview of what a 4 full-day training is. We offer advanced trainings regarding specific areas of like interviewing, mapping and other practice tools, subject matter, advocate training. So these slides also, I will add that they're used all over the place. So there's like women's sector, that would be like a domestic violence advocate. So these slides are used interchangeably throughout states and regions and countries. So evaluation services and online courses. So Once COVID hit in March, the Saving Together really enhanced their website and offerings in regards to what is available online, obviously, because I haven't trained in person for quite some time. So there's lots of online courses, there's podcasts, there's other webinars. Some are for a fee and some are free. So I would encourage you to check that out. I think towards the end, there'll be a slide about the website, etc. You can go ahead and change. So specifically the 4-day core, an overview. So it's been modified over the years since I started training. And I really like the way it's been changed. So the actual model itself has not changed. It's just the way that we're delivering it. It's a little bit more organized, if you will. So each day is highlighting something different. So the first day of training is all about assessment and kind of learning the model, what the model is, the ideas and the principles of the model, and how we're assessing domestic violence. Day 2 is your interviewing. So now that we have that understanding, that kind of foundation of what the model is we're giving the participants of the training, how are we interviewing? What are some good interviewing skills and techniques and questions to even ask? The day 3 is about documentation. So as we know, I'm sure like all of you, but I know for sure in child welfare, we have to document every time somebody sneezes. And April's laughing because she knows that's the truth. So everything. But it's important, and documentation is very, very important. Not only what we document, but how we're documenting it. So there's a whole day about how to document cases when there's domestic violence involved. And then that 4th day of training is about case planning. So we're kind of taking that continuum of what a child welfare case looks like, is that assessment and that intake and interviewing, building all the way through documentation, and then how are we case planning? So if we're determining that a family, there's a need for involvement via courts or an ongoing level, how are we writing better case plans, in terms of how we're serving families? The 1-day overview, which is what we're doing right now, is just providing, like I said, a very high level overview of the model, of what the themes of the model are, the principles, the components, and some of the practice tools. You can go ahead and change. All right, so this is a continuum. So if we looked at the left side of the continuum, the top part of the slide, it says domestic violence destructive. And then as we go to the right, it talks about neglectful. And these are in terms of our practice, right? So what is domestic violence destructive practice? All the way as we go to the right, that neglectful practice. So neglectful is a little bit better than destructive. And then competent, or pre-competent, excuse me, is a little bit better. And then your competent practice. And then all the way to where your proficient practice is. So when we talk about this during the full training, and even right now, what we're doing is trying to help people understand is you could be at different areas, right? Maybe overall you would say, I would rate myself as competent or pre-competent or whatever. But there might be some things as what we do is we'll talk about, there's lots of examples in the training. Where are you as an individual? Like, look at the destructive column. Are these examples anything that you've done or said? You personally as a worker, because I know there have been things prior to me having this training. I know there was things that I said that were destructive practice because I didn't know any better. But there were things that I was doing that were good too, right? So you might circle things like, "Ooh, I've done that, and that's neglectful," but I've also done that, and that shows that I'm competent. So maybe on an average, I'd be pre-competent. So the idea of this continuum is how do we get ourselves and our personal practice all the way up to our unit and our agency and our partners, right, to improve and move towards the right side, right, closer to the proficient, or to get to proficient type of practice. So some of the things that we talk about. So where it says weak nexus, the things under that. So all about the adults. So the idea, if we are saying that domestic violence is just about adults, domestic violence is not an issue about children, that is destructive practice, because what we know and best practice would say is that, yes, domestic violence is occurring amongst adults, but if there are children in that household, it is impacting those children, period. We know that, and the impact is in different ways, but domestic violence is not just about the adults. And so we look at that strong nexus, is that what we know is that domestic violence is, it is a child protection, it is a child protection issue if domestic violence is occurring. Failure to protect, that is in quotes, because that is a term that has been used, is still probably used around child welfare and community partners that child welfare works with, is the idea of failure to protect. And so typically this is used in context with mom is not protecting her kids. She's not leaving him. So she's clearly not protecting her kids. And so what this model does is we have to think beyond that to the perpetrator's pattern. Why does it appear that she's failing to protect? So this model really gets us to start looking at domestic violence in a different way, is that maybe she's tried to leave before and she got physically assaulted worse than before. Maybe she tried to leave, but he's the sole breadwinner. Maybe she, or he's threatened if you do X, Y, and Z. There's multitude of examples, of why she didn't leave. What if he is a police officer and he's abusing her physically, emotionally? This is why she wouldn't call the police. It's very easy for folks to say, well, she's not protective. She didn't call the police, so how is she being protective? Well, maybe last time she called the police, maybe they came out and they said, hey, you need to go take a walk. And so what we know is that maybe he went and took a walk, or, hey, can you just leave? Can you go stay someplace else? Oh yeah, sure, I'll go stay someplace else. Does he really go stay someplace else? Maybe, probably not. Where is he doing? He's coming right back. The violence is getting, and it gets worse. So we have to start looking beyond of her not protecting to what are his patterns? What do we know about his patterns in this current relationship? What do we know about any patterns in the past of why it's making it difficult to leave, or why of what's going on? Fathers are invisible. So that's under that weak nexus. So historically, and probably often, or not often, but still in child welfare in bits and pieces, and I think overall we're getting better at this, is that typically fathers have been invisible. When we think about in child welfare anyway, and I've been here long enough to know that we're very maternal driven, right? What is mom doing? What is mom not doing? What should she be doing? What shouldn't she be doing? When we're really not asking those same things. Where's dad? What is he doing? What is he not doing? What should he be doing? What shouldn't he be doing? He's a parent just as much as she is, right? And so we can't make fathers invisible, because what we know is that dads are important to kids, right? Kids need both of their parents in whatever capacity is possible when it's healthy and safe. So again, going from the other side, from fathers are invisible to holding high standards for fathers, right? Is that we in child welfare historically, and again, probably still now, we have very high standards for what moms should and shouldn't be doing. Like, you have to do this, you have to go to your meetings, you have to go to counseling, you have to do this, you get to get kids counseling, you better get them to school, you better help your homework, why is their homework slipping? All these things. And I talk about like juggling. I can't juggle, not even two. I know I can't. But we expect so much out of moms, and don't drop a ball, right? Because if you drop a ball, it's going to say that you're not compliant with us. If you miss an appointment, you didn't reschedule, we're so fast to judge, right? But what we want to be able to do in terms of more proficient domestic violence practice is we are holding these same standards, very high standards for dad, right? Violence is not acceptable, period. No, I don't care. It's not acceptable, period. And if we're saying mom has to get the kids to the doctor, well, hey, you do too, right? So how can you transport kids to doctor's appointments? Or if you can't transport because you don't have a car, how can you be responsible to call and schedule, for transportation services? Or mom's not the only one who should be participating in doctor's appointments or counseling appointments or parent-teacher conferences. These we should be expecting the same things out of dad. Finally, child and adult survivor, or child versus the adult survivor. Like, we're pitting the two against each other, when what we know is better practice is that the well-being of that child or children is directly tied to the adult survivor's safety. she cannot protect those kids, right? If she is not safe and well herself. And again, going back to high standards too, if he is the one that's causing violence in the home and controlling things in the home, we also have those high standards and say, no violence is acceptable. You are also directly responsible to keep your children safe, Dad, right? You're responsible to make sure your children are safe. That's not just her responsibility. So a couple of examples, things that I always like to bring up. I wrote some notes because they're not, what time is it too? I need to make sure we stay on track. So 3:30. So some of the things that we often hear, and I'm sure you guys do too, is that, well, she lied to us. She didn't tell us the truth. She's really had contact with him. We specifically asked her, did you have contact with him? And she said no, but she has. So one of the things that this model does is it really teaches us to look at her lying to us, or her minimizing the violence, or her minimizing the situation is her way to protect the kids, right? When we specifically think about child welfare, and all of you guys are mandated reporters, right? But when folks in the community think about child welfare, the first thing people say is, what do people in child welfare do? And is what? We take babies, we take kids away, right? And certainly, yes, we have the authority and the ability to do that when it's warranted, but there's many more cases of kids that stay with parents than those that we remove. So when we are working with a family who's experiencing domestic violence, and if we go out and saying, concerns for domestic violence, anybody? Nope. And because if child welfare came to my door and I was experiencing domestic violence, you better believe I'd say no as well, because that I would be afraid you're gonna take my kids. If I say, yep, and I'm not leaving him, because there's that fear of people aren't gonna understand why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. So the idea of lying and minimizing or not being fully truthful, we have to really shift our thinking to that. This is how she's being protective. She's trying to protect her kids. So I hope that makes sense. So another example of maybe neglectful practice would be poor court orders. Or bad services. So one of the things when I train, I will always say, no service is better than the wrong service. Anger management, family counseling is not appropriate for for couples who are experiencing domestic violence. Why? It is less than 2% effective. Statistically, 2%, less than 2% effective. Why? When we think about couples counseling, marriage counseling, the premise of that, right, is I am married to this person, or I'm in a relationship with this person, and we are coming to you to say together that we have a problem, whether it's we have a problem communicating or understand, whatever it is, but we together are owning this problem. When there's concerns for domestic violence, one person is making a choice to be violent towards somebody else. And so what we have to understand is that violence is a choice, right? And if you are choosing to be violent with me, that is not my fault, right? And so if we are coming together, that's creating a massive issue of, see, that counselor said it's your fault too, and you should be doing this, and you shouldn't egg me on or whatever. And I've said to domestic violence perpetrators during interviews, oftentimes they'll say, well, she's cheating on me, or she's doing X, Y, and Z. And my response is I don't care if she's cheating on you with 50 people. That doesn't give you the right to put her hands on you. Not saying I'm advocating for cheating on somebody with 50 people, but there is nothing that you can say that's going to convince me that is okay for you to put your hands on somebody else, right? So there's that soapbox. Anger management is a skill building program. And so what we don't need is batterers to be even more skillful. We also know that domestic violence is not about anger, so to speak. It is about power and control, right? So what anger management does is it builds on teaching more control techniques. And what we already know about domestic violence perpetrators is that they are ready in control, right? So again, this is why it's systemic, is that, we in child welfare and this one system can say, please don't send them to anger management courts, or courts, please don't order anger management. or don't, please, gosh, don't, let's not try to make a referral to whichever mental health agency for couples counseling. Let's not do that. But then that systemic issue is that. So if we're doing our practice here in this little silo, how are we getting all those other community partners to be more proficient in practice and understanding that? So I get why this is not beneficial for this family specifically, but what can I do differently that is going to be more beneficial? Let's see. Let's go ahead and change because I want to make sure we get through everything. If there's any other questions or anything while we're still have time. So this is the Safe and Together principles. I wish they would show the components as well on this, but I don't get to make the slides because I like to talk about the components better, but nobody asked me. So Safe and Together principles. So the first one says keeping the child safe and together, hence the name, with the non-offending parent. So for child welfare, and when we're using this model, our goal is identifying who's the offending parent, who's the non-offending parent when it comes to domestic violence, and how are we going to, through our interviewing, through our assessments, through our documentation and case planning, how are we keeping the child or children safe and together with that non-offending parent? Kind of like I just said a few minutes ago, a lot of folks that we work with are terrified. No matter how many times that they've worked with our agency, whether it's been in, I've had 10 different intake workers come out over the past couple of years, or I've had an open case. I've been to court. I've been in front of Judge Williams or Judge Vandervoort or whomever. My kids have been removed before. They're terrified. They know what can happen. And once we get involved, and especially long-term, it's not so easy to get out of. It's a lot of work, right? But how are we, by using this model, how are we keeping kids with that non-offending parent, right? Also understanding that there's a vast majority of families that, so when we say this, like keeping kids safe and together with a non-offending parent, that kind of in some ways assumes that parents are living separate, which sometimes is the case. But there's often times where parents are still living together, right? Domestic violence could still be happening. What is the frequency? What is the severity? What is the duration, et cetera? But how are we not just threatening removal? And way back in the day, and there are some counties that still practice that way, and I can assure you that we do our best to not do that here, is that if we have a red flag of, oh my gosh, there's this domestic violence or something, and we know about it via police reports, via mom tells us this information, via our history that we have in our system, via community partners that this family has been working with. Historically, we would jump to, holy cow, right? We got to get these kids away from both, right? Because we don't want them seeing it and hearing it and being exposed to it or injured when it happens. We better remove them. Then we'll assess, right? But what we know is that mom, the non-offending parent, is doing many, many things day in and day out to protect her kids. So that's not that failure to protect. She could be doing lots and lots of things. For something as small, and I will put that in air quotes, as if she knows that he's about to get violent with her because of her history with him, and she knows what that experience looks like and what that feels like, she could be sending kids to their room. I need you to go to your room, right? Don't come out. I've had moms tell me that before. Go to your room. I want you to turn your TV on. I want you to turn it all the way up, and I want you to have a dance party. Do not come out until I come get you. That's a really crappy situation, and I absolutely get that. But in that moment, it's not like, hey, can we not do this right now? We're gonna go here and I'm gonna take the kids here and then I'll come back. That's not always an option, right? So in that moment, she's doing what she can to protect her children. So again, what are we doing to keep kids with that non-offending parent, rather than what we know is that any removal of children is a trauma. I'm sure you guys have all heard that. So there are times when removal is necessary. In cases where there's families that are experiencing domestic violence, because just because someone is a survivor or victim of domestic violence, it does not mean that she's not addicted to methamphetamines or opiates or has significant mental health issues that are creating safety concerns, right? So this model really does address like that co-occurrence. Like, what does that look like when, yes, we can acknowledge that this violence is not her fault, but she is also using, right? And regardless of the reason of how she started, why she started, but that is creating a safety concern. So, but Otherwise, how do we keep kids safe and together with that non-offending parent? The second principle is partnering with that survivor or the non-offending parent as our default position in child welfare. So when we get referrals and caseworkers are meeting with families and going out in the field, and we know about domestic violence, it was part of the referral or as part of the history that we're able to see, and we know that that exists. Maybe that's the reason we're involved. Maybe that's one of the reasons we're involved. Our default position always, always, always has to be with that non-offending parent. So some people say, you know, oh, is that taking sides? You can look at it as that. I can see absolutely that why people would say that. But at the same time, that idea of partnering with this model is about when we're partnering with that survivor or with that domestic violence, that non-offending parent, she is the key to all the information that we need, right? And you guys need as well. She is the key to the information. We can't assume that we know more as professionals than she does about her own family and about the violence and the control that she's experiencing and how that's impacting her kids. She knows what's going right. She knows what's going on. She knows what that looks like. She knows what that feels like. And so that partnership, so part of when we talk about this partnership during the bigger, 4-day training, we talk about how are we assessing and thinking about it differently? How are we interviewing in a manner that's not going to make her feel like this is her fault? So easy questions. So a good example would be, I'm trying to think of a question that's like, have you called the police? So that is definitely a question that folks want to know, that child welfare wants to know, that teachers want to know, that mental health professionals want to know, substance abuse counselors want to know, all the people that are working with the families that we're serving. Everybody wants to know, have you ever called the police? But to me, if I'm a domestic violence survivor and you're asking me, have you ever called the police? In my head, I'm automatically thinking, do they think I should call the police? Should I say yes to this? Because what if I say no because I have, right? Like I'm thinking, like, what should I say? So a better way to answer in terms of that partnering is being able to say, has it ever been safe for you to call the police? Does that make sense? You're still going to get to that same answer, kind of, hopefully, but it might feel safer for her to answer that question, that we understand, like, we know that it may not have always been safe for you to call the police or physically able to call the police if you wanted to or felt safe enough to do so. Maybe he took the phone. Maybe he destroyed the phone. Maybe you don't even have a phone because he's controlled you to where you don't get a phone, you don't get access to a computer, you don't get social media. So if we're saying, have you ever called the police? Well, I don't have a phone, but then if I tell them I don't have a phone, they're going to think, what happens if there's an emergency for the kids? How am I going to take care? Right? So it's that like real pervasive anxiety that it'd be producing. So the third principle is intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to kids. So again, we're keeping kids safe and together with that non-offending parent. We're partnering and doing our best in terms of how we're asking questions and working alongside a domestic violence survivor. But we can't leave fathers are not invisible, right? And with this model that we have to have high standards of fathers. So we are intervening with that perpetrator, whoever is identified as the perpetrator, is that we have to be intervening. And so I know, prior to having this training, even just sitting through the training, I know I've worked with families who experienced domestic violence, and I closed lots of cases in intake because I couldn't find him. I tried calling him. I tried going to the house. Nobody answered the door. I left letters. I called. I did this. We asked the prosecutor's office. We don't have enough information. We close it, right? But how hard did I really try, right? He's got to be somewhere. Who else knows where he is? And that intervening. And it's more than just asking him those basic questions in an interview. So it's, again, that interviewing differently. And again, our interventions have to be holding that perpetrator accountable for their actions. So making sure that they're very clear that it's not, hey, let's hope for a reduction of violence. Nope. It is a cease violence, right? It is not okay. And again, that violence is a choice. And what this model will also say is that not only is violence a choice, but using violence is a parenting choice. So when it comes to child welfare, that means there's obviously kids involved some way, somehow. We're not going to get involved with families who don't have any children, or at least our agency won't. You guys may. But we have to identify that being violent is a choice, and it is also a choice you're making as a parent. right? Whether your kids are present in the home or not. Because there's lots of cases that I have worked also that, and I genuinely believe this, that the violence has happened when kids are at school. So the kids didn't see anything, they didn't hear anything, right? And to some extent, that's okay. We don't want kids seeing things. We don't want kids hearing things, obviously, but they're aware of what's going on. It doesn't just only happen when they're at school. So, and again, maybe the violence did, but they're aware of that control aspect. So that kind of reminds me to rewind and talk about that definition. So law enforcement definition of domestic violence is physical violence, right? Like perpetrating like physical violence on another intimate partner or household member. When we're talking about domestic violence and child welfare and systemically with Safe and Together model, we're not only talking about that physical violence that's being perpetrated from one person to another, but also that aspect of control, like control of where you go, who you talk to, what you're allowed to say, access to a phone, access to money, access to transportation. Does that all make sense? So we're assessing not just physical violence, but the control as well. So those interventions that we're doing, interviewing, case planning services, we're again, like I said, at the very, very beginning, one of the first slides is we're keeping the perpetrator at the forefront of our practice. Okay, before I get ahead of myself, go ahead and switch slides because that will probably, yep, there it is. So this slide is called Multiple Pathways to Harm. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about because sometimes it's really that like light bulb for folks that go off like, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way. So the idea of this, before we talk specifically about the slide, is that there are multiple ways that children can be harmed, right? We all know that. But what we have to start thinking about is that not every referral that comes into child welfare or that will come across your desks, depending upon, you know, what you guys all do, is not going to always blatantly be like DV, right? There's DV. There are some, we get multiple referrals that we know there's DV. There's a domestic violence incident that occurred that so-and-so perpetrated against so-and-so because it's, you maybe came to us via law enforcement or because a kiddo told their teacher what they observed that morning or the night before, and the teacher calls us, the counselor, whomever. But we also have to start thinking about what about those other cases that come in to us, whether it's for counseling, right? Not me, obviously, but child welfare, but through counseling, through DD services, through schools, through substance dual diagnosis places, right? When there's not like the blatant like DV, right? We don't know. Nobody's ever said anything about DV with this family. So those cases that come into us, like for example, like a medical neglect. We have a hospital clinic from Children's that calls us maybe and says, this kid has, you know, heart defects or whatever, you know, whatever whatever clinic they're seeing. And they've missed this appointment, this appointment, this appointment. This is what we've done to try to engage family, blah, 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 blah. And usually it's mom. Moms miss these appointments, right? So again, the questions that we'll be asking is, what about dad? Where's dad? And have you tried to call dad? Like he's parent just as much. So those other ways that are not blatantly domestic violence. So if we look again at that bottom part of the arrow on this slide where it says perpetrators pattern, so that coercive control towards the adult survivor. Again, so what is that adult survivor controlling, right? The idea of control of vehicle, finances, money, sexual control. Coercive control can also mean violence. So we're controlling by means of violence, right? You're going to do what I say, or I'm going to beat you up, essentially, right? I'm going to try to watch my language. Actions to take and to harm the child. What do we know about the perpetrator's pattern and how that perpetrator, what actions has that perpetrator directly taken to harm children? So I talk oftentimes about the action taken to harm children. So when we think about like the game of dominoes, you set the dominoes up and then kids like to tap it and then, right? So that direct action, what has the perpetrator directly done to harm a child? Has he sexually abused the child? Has he directly physically abused a child? Or directly neglected a child, right? And so what do we know about that pattern? So not just incident driven, but holistically speaking. So we want to know what that pattern is. And how does that perpetrator, again, we're keeping the perpetrator at the forefront of our practice. How is it affecting the partner's parenting? So some of the things like, well, and I'm sure you guys just as well see too, what time is it? I'm trying to keep eye on time. Survivors that come in that are depressed, have massive anxiety, PTSD, they're using substances. How did those came to be? I was like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So sometimes you'll see, this couple met when we were 22, both 22. I'd never been diagnosed with any type of mental health disorder, diagnoses, etc. But slowly, this is what started happening. He started calling me names. And then it was a push, and then it was an apology, and then it was a slap, and then it was a punch, and then it was a kick, and then he was strangling me. So soapbox, when somebody does this to somebody, this is not choking, this is strangulation. So that's a good documentation exercise that I tell people, is people will call and say, he choked her. Choking is when we're swallowing food, and this is strangulation. So, but how has that survivor lost their authority? So we see a lot of times perpetrators tell kids, you don't have to listen to her. She doesn't know what she's talking about, or your mom's lazy, or you don't have to do those chores. That's your mom's job, right? So that loss of authority. And what energy does that survivor take or put out in terms of addressing the perpetrator's needs over the children? So we hear those perpetrators like, you better have dinner ready, you better do this house better be clean, and you have to do this during the day, and all those list of things. And when that survivor's there, I've met lots of survivors who say, I had to keep the kids quiet. If the kids cried, he would get upset. So again, those balls that we're juggling in the air, and don't you dare drop one, right? So all that energy that she puts into addressing his needs over her children, or what it appears to be over her children. Interfering with day-to-day basic routines. And we see sometimes violence and control or verbal arguing. Does that happen at dinner time, bath time, homework time, overnight? So we think kids are sleeping, but they're really awake because it's loud. They hear slamming and screaming and glass breaking or whatever, and the kids are awake. And so that multiple pathway to harm, for those of you who are in the school system, when we see kids who are sleeping all the time during the day, could it be something else? Could there be domestic violence attached, and what would that look like? Child's trauma and safety. So are they a victim of physical abuse, not just physical abuse, but sexual abuse, neglect? What are they seeing, hearing, or learning about the violence? And the effects on the family ecology. So we go back to the dominoes. This is what I usually say. So the actions taken to harm the children, that's that direct, that I'm the perpetrator and I have punched you as a child, right? Punched the child. That's a direct action of harm. But the effects on family ecology, sometimes you might have to knock down 3, 4, 5, 10 dominoes before you get to the effect, right? So I've worked with families who, because of his choice to be violent with his girlfriend, they were constantly the police were called. They were constantly getting evicted. So they were constantly moving, right? So these kids, now they were able to stay within Fairfield County, but they were constantly moving school districts. So although that's not like the worst thing possible that we can think of, but we know that's traumatic for kids, moving constantly, just physical locations, but moving from schools. You're moving away from their neighborhood friends, their school friends, their teachers, those people that they've learned to trust, right? And now that they're with a new group of people who are equally as wonderful, but that the ability to build that trust. And, maybe they've moved and they were involved in sports or band or whatever, and just moving away from those things. And so all of these things, because of the perpetrator's pattern of control and violence, it's affecting all of these things, and it's harming children. It's creating behavioral problems, emotional problems, social, educational problems, developmental problems, and obviously some physical injuries. You can go ahead and change the slide. So this is the last slide. And so this is just a quote about somebody who took the training. So the website is www.safeandtogetherinstitute.com. And you can like the website on Facebook, and you can join why can't I talk? mailing or the email like server to where you'll get email updates about free webinars, the classes that they're at reduced cost, etc. So I know, let's see, what time is it? It's like 53. So I blasted through it. So we do have time for some questions. Okay, I'm afraid to touch all these buttons. Chat, I bet you these are all the names. Yes. Does anybody have any specific questions while we have just a few minutes or comments? Virtual learning is super fun.
Casey, I have a question for you.
Absolutely.
So we do on occasion in the developmental disabilities world have maybe not individuals that have children, but perhaps there is domestic violence within a home with two adults.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something, the Safe Together Institute, something that you feel maybe one or two of our staff would benefit from to be able to utilize in our organization?
So just make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So the person associated with DD, is that a child or an adult?
It would be an adult.
An adult, but within their home, like they're caregivers.
Or we've had someone maybe that is, they're married to a peer,
Okay.
and their spouse is abusive, and maybe both of
Yeah.
them are receiving services.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, what's helpful is that, so sometimes, like I said, at the beginning of the training, when I go to different counties to train, or states for their child welfare agencies, a lot of the activities are really targeted about child welfare and how we're working with them, but the information is still, like, you can still make that lateral connection about, so even though you're not making a child welfare case plan, but the interview questions would still be appropriate for your staff to be able to learn, or just that fundamental, like, understanding of it. And so I know all the trainers, I know almost all of them, we always really do try to say, so even if there's a group of 20 people and 18 of them are in child welfare, and there's one advocate, and there's one a mental health counselor maybe, I really try, or even child welfare, but somebody's in adoption, right? So they're not doing the investigations, they're not making case plans, they're an adoption caseworker. But I really try to make it applicable, and so do the other trainers, to, so if you have a child that's in the permanent custody of an agency and you're looking for an adoptive placement, so what are those things that you need to be assessing and looking at in terms of because people can present really, really well, but there could be domestic violence going on. So those fundamental, the questions and the idea and the assessment piece, it would still be appropriate. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions for Casey? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Casey. My name is April, and I was wondering, how do one participate with? I think you said it was a four-day training.
Yes. So where do you work, April?
I'm the director of operations for B. Bentley Transportation.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we're doing all of our trainings virtually. I am typically scheduled to go to Preble County, which is way out west in Ohio, in January for like 4 or 5 people. So typically it's offered through the state of Ohio, like ODJFS sometimes will offer. But so you work in Fairfield County?
I work in Fairfield and Franklin.
In Franklin, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want, I think April might have my email. So right now, a lot of the trainings, because of COVID, are all virtual. So which the benefit of doing that is that you can allow more people. So before, if a training room only sat 30, you can only have 30. And so now with COVID, it does allow us to reach out and just because it's a lot of people from Fairfield or Franklin County, it doesn't mean somebody from Cleveland couldn't join because it's virtual. So I could forward you. I know there's lots of virtual trainings that are coming up that not just myself, but other trainers are doing, and we could see if we could forward you the information to see if it's capped out yet.
That's perfect. I'll take that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? If you guys think of anything, questions, comments, I apologize. This is so hard. When I meet with new staff here, as new caseworkers come on, I always try to talk a little bit about it, but this is a huge, huge topic and a big, big training. So there's so much information. So it's very, very hard to, to really try to get everything out, especially in an hour. But as you're going through your days and you think like, oh gosh, or, I have a question, or, oftentimes you start thinking of families that you're currently working with or families that you have worked with in the past, like, gosh, could I have done X, Y, or Z differently? Or what about this? I wonder if does this mean, April can share my email. I'm willing to, communicate that in whatever way. If you think of something next week, I'd be happy to answer questions. But I appreciate you all listening. I'm excited for you guys. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the training conference.
Thank you so much, Casey. Just a few additional things before we all wrap up. If you could please be sure that you've entered your first and last name into the chat box. We want to make sure everyone gets credit, their certificate of attendance or their CEUs. Also, I had noted in the chat box that you will receive a survey at the end, and that will be required in order for you to get your CEUs. So just keep that in mind. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is Dean Rolliff will be doing a training next Tuesday. It's October 13th from 3 to 4. He is the Behavioral Services Coordinator at Fairfield County Board of DD, and he'll be presenting on taking the trauma out of COVID-19. So the Eventbrite that you use to register for today, you can register for that session as well as a few others that we have coming up here in the next couple of months. So if there's no other questions, thanks again, Casey, for your time. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Are you holding on to the last few?
Yeah, I just thought we'd maybe chat for a minute. If not, we can always email. No big deal.
No, I'm good. I'm good for holding on. I think I've got everyone. I know I'm missing, I don't know if Maureen's still on here.
Maureen Kemper, she does. It does look like she's still on here.
I don't know if she's signed in.
I can put her name in the chat if by chance she's not there.
I'm checking them in on Eventbrite too, so that we have a good email list. And then I'm going to cross-reference it with your the chat box. Can you send it to me? I think it went